Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for History Speaks. Today we have the wonderful author and historian Greg Olson, and he is going to be speaking to us about Jeffrey Deroine. And this is all part of History Speaks this year for the Missouri Bicentennial. So we are very excited to have Greg today.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Um, yeah, this is a presentation I put together about Jeffrey Deroine or Deroine, and I'll get into that a little bit later about different ways to pronounce his name. And I call the presentation a life documented in fragments because he's one of those people that is actually the way I found out about him is I've done a lot of research on the Iowa tribe that lives right across the river from St. Joseph in White Cloud, Kansas. And I kept running across these references for Jeffrey Deroine. And he just kept showing up. There was never a lot of information about him, but there would be a little snippet here, a little snippet there. And I started getting really curious about, well, who is this guy? And so I started collecting. I had a file on him. And so piece by piece, the information started to kind of come together. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the documents I've collected and tell and just show what I learned from each of these documents. And I also want to give a shout out to some of the people who have been helpful to me because I have not found all these documents myself. Trevor Tutt has been helpful. Sarah Elder has been helpful, and also Becky Carlson, who I used to work with when I was at the Missouri State Archives. She's a field archivist up in Holt County, so she gets to go through the court records and everything. And every once in a while, I'll get a really interesting email from Becky. So the question is, like, who is Jeffrey Deroine or Deroine? This is really the only picture we have of Jeffrey, and it was done by George Caleb Bingham, the painter who came through St. Joseph and up the Missouri River in the 1830s and visited a lot of the Iowas at that time. This picture is some version. I don't know if it's a lithograph. I think it must be a drawing or a lithograph that Catlin did when he took 14 Iowas to London to accompany his gallery of Native American paintings. He had, I think, 500 paintings he'd done, portraits and paintings of native life and portraits of native people. And Jeffrey was the interpreter for the Iowas on that trip. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But so this is really, I'll show you a sketch later that Catlin did that I think has Jeffrey in it. But this is really the only picture we have to work with. And this is one of the things about this guy is he's so elusive. Like I said, he keeps showing up in everyone else's stories, but he hardly has ever had a story been in the story or his own story rather. So who was he? And this is kind of interesting. He was African American. Actually, he was of mixed ethnicity, as we'll see later in one of the documents. But for a person who was a former slave, he was an amazing person because he had a chance to do a lot of different things in his lifetime. At various times in his life, he was a slave, but he was also, I've just learned recently, a slave owner, which is something we're going to have to kind of think about. He was a free man. He was a slave who became a free person of color in Missouri. He was a Roman Catholic. He was a businessman. He was a translator, a federal employee. He was a husband, a father, a squatter, and a landowner. He was a trader, and he was an alleged bootlegger. And I think also there's an argument to be made that he could be considered one of St. Joseph's founders. He was definitely around St. Joseph. He owned land very early and was there at the very beginning. And we'll talk more about most of these different roles that he played here as we go along. So why is he so elusive? It's really kind of hard to find information. And ever done any genealogy can sympathize if you're going through old records, especially anything before the 20th century. You get into 19th century and 18th century records, you'll find that There were a gazillion different ways to spell even the simplest name. And so what I've written here are just some of the many ways I've found Jeffrey's name spelled in different documents. And most people will call him Jeffrey Dorian. I know that over on the Iowa reservation, some of the people I've talked to about him will call him Jeffrey Dorian. And you'll see there's Jeffrey Deroine, Jeffrey Dorian, but then you get Jeffrey Dorway and Dorney. And so I've kind of taken to calling him Jeffrey Deroine, actually, based on some of the ways I've seen it spelled. But hey, there's a lot of different ways to spell his name. And this, again, is one of the challenges about doing research on somebody like this. It's really hard to find information when you just can't put in one spelling in a search engine. So as I said, Jeffrey was a slave, and he, as a slave, filed a freedom suit against his owner, who happened to be Joseph Robidoux. And from this case, which if anybody's interested, I can't remember how many pages this case is, but it's dozens of pages, both in English and in French, I think, that are in the circuit court case files in St. Louis. And I think in the early 1800s, maybe 1808 or something like that, Missouri passed a law that slaves could sue in court for their freedom. And so Jeffrey's freedom suit is just one of many, I think 300 freedom suits that were filed in St. Louis. And in the court documents, we find out a lot of interesting things about Jeffrey, including his birth date. He was born May 14th, 1806. His grandmother, Rachel Camp, filed this lawsuit in 1822. And she did that because at that time, Jeffrey would have been a minor, and a minor was not able to file a lawsuit on his own behalf. So a woman named Rachel Camp, who in the documents claimed to be his grandmother, filed the court case for him. Excuse me. We find out that he was raised by a man named Francis Deroine, and I have to think that's probably where he picked up his name. We don't really know who his father was exactly, or his mother, but we do know that at a very early age, he became a slave of Joseph Robidoux's. And as a Robidoux's slave, he worked of course, Robidoux is known as a trader, so Jeffrey would have worked as a helper in the fur trade and the trade business that Robidoux had on the Missouri River. And in that capacity, we know that he learned a lot of different languages because they worked with the Iowas, the Omahas, the Osages, any nation that was living along the Missouri River, they would have had to know how to communicate with them. So Jeffrey quickly learned the business of being a trader, and he quickly learned how to speak a lot of different languages. And as I mentioned earlier, the last bullet point, he sued Robidoux for his freedom on the basis of assault and battery, false imprisonment, and he also asked for $1,000 in damages. When Jeffrey was pretty young, they give the date in the freedom suit, and I've forgotten just what the date is, but he was a teenager. Joseph Robidoux is alleged to have beaten him fairly severely, and that, I think, was the basis upon which this lawsuit was filed. Well, Jeffrey's freedom suit never did go to trial. Robidoux was a savvy businessman, and he had a lot of lawyers who were able to sort of keep the suit tied up in court for more than a decade. And so, in the time that he was working with Joseph Robidoux on the Missouri River, both Robidoux and Jeffrey had a lot of contact with the Iowa tribe of Native Americans. Of course, Robidoux had a daughter who was half Iowa, and of course Jeffrey visited and worked with the Iowas a lot in the business of trade. And the Iowas were they first of all became very fond of Jeffrey over time. They got to know him. But they also really appreciated the fact that he could speak their language and English and French and Spanish and several other native languages. And the Ioways had been burned previously in a treaty negotiation where they did not understand fully the treaty because they did not, it was not translated to them in their language. So they worked out a deal with Joseph Robidoux where the Ioways bought Jeffrey's freedom for $600. And then, so here I have found a copy, and this is one of the things I just sort of ran across before I even really knew who Jeffrey was, but this is his bill of sale from Robidoux. It doesn't exactly say who bought Jeffrey, but we'll get into that a little bit later. And this was, I think, in 1832. So another place that I kind of found these random bits of information about Jeffrey were in first-person accounts from different people. In working on different books about the Iowa Nation, I went through several documents and files and things like that to find out information about the Iowa tribe. And I went through their agency files, and in there, I found something from Andrew Hughes. Andrew Hughes was the Iowa's Indian agent for the time during the time period when they moved from Missouri over to Kansas. And he talks about a conversation he had with John Doherty, whose picture is on the slide here. And here we get a little bit of information about personal information about Jeffrey, that he was part French, part Spanish, Negro, and American, which I think is kind of that he was American. Jeffrey was a free man at the time. He was 28 years of age, 6'2". They say he was a fine-looking man and was a very bright mulatto. And here we also find out that he had a wife, and his wife was the Iowa or mixed Iowa daughter of Gabriel Vasquez, who was at one time in Iowa, one of the earlier Iowa agents. He's described as being temperate, an active and good man. He's esteemed by all, and definitely sounds like he's pretty well liked by all who know him. And we'll contrast that with another personal account. This one is by a later Iowa agent who was their agent in the 1840s, a man named William Richardson. Richardson did not like Jeffrey. They had issues. They had butted heads a few times. And in, I think, about 1841 or 1842, Richardson was able to get Jeffrey fired from his job as interpreter from the Iowa tribe and kicked off the Iowa reservation. And this is sort of a discussion about what Richardson thought Jeffrey had done. He charged him with giving and selling the Iowa Indians whiskey. This was a big problem on a lot of reservations, but especially on the Iowa reservation in Kansas. A lot of illegal traders would come across the Missouri River from Missouri and sell alcohol to the natives. And if you were a trader, you were kind of caught in a bind, because if you didn't try to get rid of the alcohol trade, then you were accused of being in cahoots with them and of being intemperate. But if you did try to stop the alcohol trade, then the backers in Missouri who were financing the alcohol trade, and usually were fairly prominent people, would call their political friends and try and get you removed from your job. So that was a real no-win situation for Indian agents who were in charge of the reservations. And then he goes on to say that he charges Jeffrey with failing to interpret correctly, and he thought that Jeffrey was prejudicing the Iowa Indians against him, against their teachers and the preacher, the missionaries who were at the Iowa reservation, and using his influence to really enrich himself and to keep the Iowas sort of down and impoverished. So there we have two very different firsthand accounts about the kind of person Jeffrey was. Now, as I mentioned, in 1844, 45, and early 46, 14 Ioways went to Europe. And this was part of George Catlin's Indian Gallery, he called it. He would rent out an exhibition hall. He would hang his portraits. And if you can see on the back wall of this drawing, you can see what looks like kind of a rough sketch. And I think those are probably all of his portraits hung salon style on the wall. And here we have something about how Jeffrey made his debut as an interpreter. What they would do is Catlin would bring the Ioways up on stage. They would sing. They would do some of their traditional dances, and really put on a show for the people of London. And then later it moved on, and they went to France and Belgium, other countries in Europe. And Jeffrey was the person who had to translate. So here is a case of an Iowa named the Doctor, Thinyadye, and he's standing up telling a story, and Jeffrey's job was then to get up and to translate what he was saying for the people. And so he became the voice really of the Ioways as they went through Europe. And not only was he was really handy, because not only was he able to translate the Iowa language into English when they were in London, but he was able to do the same in French when they were in Paris, because he knew French. So he was really invaluable. And I think, if I can get my my little laser pointer here. Oh, there we go, red. And I think one of these two people right back here, maybe Jeffrey Deroine. I can't tell you which one it is. One of them is probably Catlin, and the other one is Jeffrey. So there's another firsthand account. In 1846, then the Ioways returned to their reservation in Kansas, and Francis Whitecloud had been sort of the leader of the delegation that went to Paris, or went to London and Paris. And when they got back, they returned just in time for another upheaval. And once again, I think through William Richardson, they had worked to, Richardson really wanted to get Jeffrey, pardon me while he had really wanted to get Jeffrey out of off the reservation again. He'd kicked him off once in the, like I said, in 1842. They got back though, and apparently, this is a really interesting story. Apparently, there were African Americans who would come across the Missouri River and live with the natives in the Iowa reservation. And a lot of them were, or at least some of them were, escaped slaves. And so what you have is William Richardson, and then Thomas Harvey, I think, was the superintendent of Indian Affairs in St. Louis. And so what they're doing here is they're having a council with Francis Whitecloud, and they're telling Francis and some of the other headmen of the Ioways that that the reservation had been set aside for them. He says, "Your redbirds and blackbirds have no business among you," and I can only assume that blackbirds mean African Americans, some escaped slaves, people who were living with the Ioways. And he said that therefore we're going to have to send the blackbirds away. You must think of this country as yours. It's reserved for Indians, not for Negroes. I can't permit them to associate with you. And then Francis Whitecloud says that he purchased Jeffrey, one of the Negroes that was alluded to, and he thought Jeffrey ought to stay. And here Major Harvey says, well, if you purchase Jeffrey, you've done enough for him. And in Harvey's opinion, he was a very bad man. And this, again, I think goes back to some of the charges that Jeffrey was trading illegally, but also trading alcohol. And it's quite possible that he was trading, because he'd learned the business from Joseph Robidoux over the years, and I think probably became pretty business savvy. Whether or not he was trading in alcohol kind of remains to be seen. There are a lot of lot of opinions about that. In 1859, Jeffrey Deroine passed away, I think probably in St. Joseph, and this is a copy of his, a short version of his obituary. And what's interesting to me, so this is a former slave, an African American who was became a free man in 1832, and when he died, he was considered a prominent enough member of the community that his death was noticed and published in the St. Joseph Gazette. And not only that, we can see by the document on the right there that it was also carried in the Hannibal paper. So it was one of those articles that other papers across the state picked up, which I think is pretty interesting. And in the obituary, we find out that Jeffrey had married a freed slave from Kentucky at the time, just before the time of his death, and we are not able to find out his name. So again, another piece of information. All right, and here we have one copy of his will. This is a copy that's in the St. Joseph files at the St. Joseph Museum. And this is really interesting because we find out more about him here. We find out that Jeffrey had two sons, one named Jesse and one named Bella. And what's interesting about that is Jesse and Bella were also the names of sons that Andrew Hughes had. So there you can tell that Andrew Hughes and Jeffrey Deroine had a very close relationship. Excuse me. What is also interesting is that even though Jeffrey had to have his freedom purchased from Joseph Robidoux, he continued to do business throughout his life with the Robidoux family. And Felix Robidoux, one of Joseph Robidoux's sons, was the executor of Deroine's estate, which I find really interesting. We also find out in the will that Jeffrey owned land in Holt County, Missouri, and in St. Joseph. And this made him one of the very few free people of color to own land in Missouri prior to the end of slavery. And then this is also something Trevor Tuck came up with from the St. Joseph Museum, and this is from the History of Ebenezer African Methodist Episcopal Church in St. Joseph. And it talks about a piece of property being purchased back and forth from Jeffrey to Joseph Robidoux and from Felix Robidoux to Joseph's sons. So again, it's just another incident of the fact that Jeffrey continued to do business with the Robidoux family. And I had read in other places that the fact that, that Joseph Robidoux and Jeffrey Deroine had gone through this 10-year lawsuit had really soured them on each other. And that there was a lot of hard feelings about it. But at the same time, it's interesting here we can find out that they continued to do business with each other. I guess business is business, huh? And this is the newest piece of the puzzle that Becky Carlson sent me from Holt County a year or so ago. It's a court case. And basically what's happening here is there is a man named William Wallace, and he is a person of color. And he was picked up because the sheriff of Holt County assumed that he was a runaway slave. And so the sheriff picked him up and put him in jail in Holt County. And this is a petition from William Wallace explaining that he is actually not a slave, but he is a free person, and that he was a slave and he was the property of one Jeffrey Deroine, who by his last will and testament emancipated him. So this is, and I'm not quite sure what to make of this. It's really interesting because, so here we have a former slave owning a slave. It could be that somehow he inherited the slave somehow. It also could be that Jeffrey was a man of means. Remember, he was a landowner, he had some money. It's possible that he bought the slave, that he bought William Wallace to give him his freedom, much like he had been purchased. His freedom had been purchased when he was a young man. So that's something that we're going to have to take a look at. Who was William Wallace? And it also mentions somewhere in here that his mother's name was Isabel. So that's another interesting part of the puzzle. And that's it. That's Jeffrey's story is really complicated, but I think we only know just a small part of it. And new documents, as I said, have been coming up all the time, and people will sometimes send me emails, and they will sometimes let me know of new things they find, and I really, really appreciate that. So the story, I don't think the story about Jeffrey has really been written yet. If you're interested in more information, I put two different sources here, both things that I have written for information, although I will warn you that as the story is ongoing and as we're always finding out more about Jeffrey, both of these are a little out of date, but at the same time, they do give you a good background. The article on the left is from the Missouri Historical Review, and it came out in the year 2013. And the great thing about the Missouri Historical Review is a lot of their back issues, almost all of their back issues now are online. I think up until, well, I know this one, the 2013 issue is online. So if you're interested, you can look that up for free on the internet. And then on the right side is a book that I worked on with the Truman State University Press in 2015. And it's actually a history book that was written for fourth and fifth graders to use in their Missouri history studies curriculum. But I've had a lot of adults tell me they enjoy reading it because it kind of gives the story of Jeffrey and Francis White Cloud and all the characters that I've talked about. But if you're interested, those are probably two of the places to start. Unfortunately, Truman State University Press has recently gone out of business, but the books are available on Amazon. And I think that I know at one time the St. Joseph Museums had a copy too. So, and if you're interested, I've got my email there, and I'd be happy if you have questions or information. I'd be happy to chat with you. So anyway, Jennifer, that's about as much as I've got to say about Jeffrey right now.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. And the St. Joseph Public Library also has your book on Jeffrey
Right.
Deroine, and we also have bound copies of the Missouri Historical Review if for some reason somebody can't find it online. But this is really
That's right.
fascinating.
Yeah,
And
it's an interesting. It's almost like detective work. I love it. It's really fascinating. So
absolutely. And I love seeing, this is a very good example of what historians go through. It's, you think that you have a good portion of the story and then you find something else that really
yeah.
changes, what you thought. So this is really great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for asking. I enjoyed it.
All right.